Tonight, we're going to take a look at Parshas Mattos, Emir Hashem, and a little bit of Parshas Masai. We'll try to see if we could cover our bases for both. Parshas Mattos, Perek Lamed of Sefer Bamidbar, opens with the Parsha of Nidorim. And as you know, and I mentioned it already last year, there's a neder and a shvua. And the Gemara at the beginning of Nidorim points out that a neder is an Isur Hefza, whereas a shvua is an Isur Gavra. The Sifri, quoted here by the Ramban at the beginning of our Parsha, comments that there's a fundamental difference between a neder and a shvua. A neder is b'chaye hamelech, on the life of the king, and a shvua is b'melech atzma. It's on the king himself. Very ambiguous words. So let's keep this in mind and talk about one other very fundamental difference between a neder and a shvua. A neder, generally speaking, requires what's called hatfasa. Hatfasa means that I point to an object that's already prohibited, and then I point to another object which is permitted, and I say harei zeh kozeh. I basically attach the two objects and extend the Isur over to the heter. That's how I convert and transform heter into Isur. In the case of Shvuah, there's no requirement, there's no halach of hatfas at all. So let's see if we can get a grasp and put into perspective the difference between a neder, which is called b'chaye hamelech, the life of the king, and a Shvuah, which is called b'melech atzma. And immediately, intuitively, we get the sense that a shvua is more profound, more intense. It's the melech atzmo, it's the king himself. Neder is on an object. Who created the object? God created all the universe and everything within it. And the question is, does man have the right to enter into God's universe and change the status of that which God created? What endows man with the ability to do so? This is called b'chaye hamelech. Chaye hamelech means that which we see revealed in nature, and it means the sum total of the universe and everything within all that God created. That's called chaye hamelech, the creations of the Almighty. If God has already something that's asur, let's take, for example, a korban, kodshim, which is already prohibited, then man, in his relationship to the world, which God created, he can take that isur and attach it, extend it from one object to the other. That's what a neder is all about. That's called b'chaye hamelech. And what it means is that chaye hamelech refers to the manifestation and the reflection of the Almighty in the created world, in every object. So God's revelation, in a sense, manifests itself throughout the entire creation. So a neder really can take effect when man prohibits an object that God created by extending another object with its Isur that God created and transposing that Isur, extending it to another object. By contrast, Shvuah is an Isur Gavra. There's no object involved. Man must be utilizing a tremendous power, almost a divine-like power, to create Isur when there's no atfasa, there's no other object that was there that was asur. Has Shvuah enabled man to make such an impact and create such a prohibition? What brings man to the level of Hamelech Atzmo? Not the creations that God has created. That's called Chaye Hamelech. But Hamelech Atzmo means the essence of God. And man represents the essence of God, because man was endowed with Tselem Elokim, with a divine soul that is Chelek Elokam Imal. And here, in the case of a Shvuah, man is going to implement that power. He's almost like an extension, an agent of the Almighty God. And that is Ba'melech Atzmo. And in the case of a Shvuah, we have to take, according to many Rishonim, a Shvuah b'Shem Hashem. And what that means is that I take a Shvuah in the name of God, meaning I have the image of God. I was created in God's image. And when I enunciate the name of God, I am taking, so to speak, my image, created in the image of God, and I'm using that as a formula to create an Isur. And in that sense, we could say that a Shvuah is more fundamental, more profound even than a Neder, because it's B'chai HaMelech Atzmo. Now, here at the beginning of Parshas Mattos, with regard to Nedarim, the Torah says, Pasuk Gimel, at the beginning of Lamed, Ishki dar neder Hashem, etc., etc. He has a neder, he has a shvuah. Lo yachel dvara. He shall not desecrate and annul or violate his pledge, his vow. And Chazal make a comment in Masechet Nedarim on Daf Chav Zayin that he should not nullify and violate his neder, but others can, and that's called heter nedarim, hataras nedarim. But before we discuss a little bit, maybe we could touch on hataras nedarim and how that operates. I wanted to discuss with you the method, actually two different methods, by which the tribunal of three, or if it's one Yachid Mumcha, one outstanding scholar, he's worth three, can be mater and neder. How, by what method can they void a neder or a shvuah? And there are two approaches. One approach is called charata, and the other is called Pesach. We'll try to explain. Charata means remorse. And a person realizes that he took a neder and he feels genuinely remorseful. He regrets that he took the neder. Let's give an example. Sometimes a person changes his personality over the course of time. We're not always the same throughout our entire lives. So at a certain moment in time, when he was such a personality, he took a neder. Today, he's a different person. And he realizes that he made a mistake, and he has charata, and he regrets that he took the neder. The chacham, or the tribunal of three, they will take his charata and make it into a mistake, as if to say he was mistaken. Like, for example, if I sell you a field or any other object and there was a mistake, I didn't realize this, or the buyer didn't realize this, so he can null and void the sale. Here also, the chachamim, the tribunal, and for our purposes, I'll call it chacham echad, so I don't have to repeat myself over and over again. The chacham will take this charata and he will make the following opening, so to speak, on the neder. He will say that if this person would have been then what he is today, after he changed his personality, he never would have taken this neder. And therefore the neder is void. Let me give an example of charata. A person very often bears a grudge against someone. And as a result of that grudge, he feels that he was slighted, and he holds in his heart a certain element of chas v'shalom enmity towards his friend. And he's angry. His anger when he got insulted is palpable. Now, time has gone by, and his set of values is changed. He has a different set of priorities, and he realizes that why did I overreact? Why did I get so angry? Why am I holding a grudge against this person? And while he was in the state of anger, his personality took it upon himself to take a neder or a shvua in which he excluded that person and, so to speak, punished him, kept him far away. You can't come near my house. And he put his neder on it. Now, a month later, a year later, 10 years later, he's changed his personality. His set of values has changed. He has charata. He's remorseful. What did this guy do to me? Kleinigkeit, as we say in Yiddish, little things. And for that, I overreacted. I got so angry, I put him into a neder situation. And in that sense, what originally seemed to be in his mind of ultimate importance today seems trivial and childish. So the Chacham says, well, if his worldview would have been then what it is today, he never would have taken such a neder. And that's called charata. That's remorse. There's a second method by which a Chacham could annul a void and void a neder. And that's called Pesach. What is Pesach? Pesach, which literally translates as an opening, means the following: that a person was unaware of the ultimate down the line repercussions of his neder. And now in hindsight, when he reevaluates the neder, he says, why did I take this neder? Look at what I suffered and look how negatively it impacted on my life. I should never have taken that neder. Now, similar to the case of Pesach, similar to the case of Charot, in the case of Pesach, in both cases, the Chacham is going to try to establish, based on the Charot or the Pesach, that the person really did not want this neder. At that time, he was very angry in his set of priorities and his values. He thought he was doing the right thing because this person had hurt him and insulted him. But today, he has a different set of values. He's a different person. Had he been then what he is today, he never would have taken the neder, and therefore that's called charata. The neder is considered null and void, as if it was taken on the false premises, and that's called charata. But Pesach also comes to the same goal. The agenda is the same, and the Chacham is going to say, look, he didn't realize at the time that he took the neder what it would mean, how much it would impact in a negative way on his life down the line. And now he reevaluates himself and reevaluates the neder. And since he did not foresee the consequences of the neder, he made an error in evaluation when he took the neder. And the example of Pesach is a person who took it upon himself to fast every, let's call it 15th day of the Hebrew calendar month. And now he realizes that sometimes the 15th day of the calendar coincides with Shabbos, with Yontif. He doesn't want to ruin his Shabbos or his Yontif by fasting. He didn't calculate when he took the neder, he didn't evaluate the long-term consequences of that neder. And that's called Pesach. In a sense, charata is really a result of the impact of sin on the personality of the sinner. What do I mean? Although charata is a word and a term that's deeply rooted in the laws of Nedarim, we find its parallel in the laws of tshuva. A person does tshuva in a classic sense because of charata. He has remorse. What brings about the remorse? Why is there a change in personality in the case of tshuva of charata, like the case of a neder that's being annulled because of charata? The parallel is very sharp. It's very accurate. It's literally a mirror image, because a person sinned and he had a certain value system, and at that time, given his personality, he fell prey to all sorts of temptations. And then one day he wakes up and he has a sense of emptiness that brings him to remorse. The sin impacts on his personality, and he becomes aware of the fact that he has contaminated himself. So just like in the case of neder, when a person comes to the chacham and he presents to him his charata, and he's telling the chacham that I have a different set of values, I'm a different person today, and don't relate to me, what I was like at the time that I took the neder. So too, in the process of tshuva, charata means that a person didn't realize what would be the natural consequence of his personality. The sin makes it impossible for him to be one with himself as a new person. He has now, over the course of time, since committing the Avera, he has changed his personality. He has a different value system. But the sin gnaws away at him. It bothers him. He feels disgusted by his own actions. How could I have stooped so low? Charata and tshuva is based on the pasuk Chatoim Tirdof Nafshi, or Tirdof Ra, which means that the chet itself is the rodef, and the chote is the nirdaf. What does that mean? The chet runs after him, and it constantly gnaws at him and gives him the sense of what monstrosity. How could I have done such thing? He's plagued by the sin. The impact of the sin is a plague because of his new personality. And in the light of the new personality, he comes in front of the Kisei HaKavod and he says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I have genuine remorse. I can't keep running away as a fugitive from the sin that's running after me. It's a chet that's tirdof ra. And just like in the case of a neder, the chacham could be matir the neder and annul it. By virtue of charata, you have a different set of values. Why did you take this neder against him? Because what? He didn't say good morning to you. He didn't give you a lollipop to eat. But what childishness is foolishness. You're on a higher level today. You never would have taken that neder. So too, when a person comes to the front in the Rabbanu Shalom, he says, I am plagued by the neder. It gnaws at me. I'm on a different level today. HaKadosh Baruch Hu accepts that charata and grants atonement, nullifying as it was. But there's another method, as we said before, through which a chacham can be matir and neder, and that's called a Pesach. In the case of a Pesach, it was an era of judgment when he took the neder. He did not evaluate the impact and the long-term repercussions of that neder. He did not calculate what it would mean for him to fast every 15th of the month. And it coincides and clashes with Shabbos, with Yontif, with the Rosh Chodesh, with the Chanukah, with the Purim. And the neder interferes with his enjoyment, and therefore he comes with the Pesach. In a parallel way, there is a tshuva of a Pesach. And what that means is that very often man sins and he doesn't calculate, he doesn't judge properly. He makes an error in judgment as to what the long-term repercussions will be of his sin. And he comes to the Ribono Shel Olam and he says, oh, if only I would have known what this would do to my life, the mistakes I made and the judgmental errors that I made, I couldn't foresee at that time the consequences. Today, I see the consequences. So just to summarize, we opened up tonight by discussing the difference between a neder and a shvua. Neder is b'chaya melech, shvua is b'melech atzmo. We tried to understand that, two methods of effectuating a neder. And now we're discussing two methods of annulling a neder, which is called ataris nedarim, and their parallel in the world of tshuva. I'd like to discuss with you a pasuk in Perek Lamed Aleph in the Parsha of Klei Midian, after the war against Midian, in which the Jewish nation was victorious. They took kalim, utensils from the Midianim, and those kalim very often were used for food, and of course, non-kosher food. And the Torah says in Pasuk Chaf Beis that if the utensils made of metal, whether it be gold or kesef or nechoshes, it's copper, it's metal, it's lead, the Pasuk gives a whole list. And here's what you do with these kalim. Kol davar sheyava ba'esh, taviru ba'esh, v'taher. V'kol asher lo yava ba'esh, taviru b'mayim. There are two methods of koshering a dish, a utensil that was used for non-kosher food. One is called mayim, and the other is called eish. Mayim is what we call hagola, and we boil up, as you know, a pot full of hot water, and then we immerse this non-kosher keli that has a blia of tarfus, and we put it inside the water. The other method is called libun. Libun means that if there was a direct absorption of the taste of Isa through fire, not through a cooking process, then in order to kasher the keli, we need to put it into fire. And that's called libun. So we have hagola through mayim and libun through H. The Torah uses the word v'taher. And once again, I'm tempted to think that this parsha, to some extent, maybe not at the level of pshat, but at least at the level of remez or drush, is connected to the parsha of nedarim, of heter nedarim, of Pesach and Charata and Tshuva. And v'taher means that you have to purify the kli. Now again, technically speaking, according to Jewish law, we're not really talking about a process of tara. We're not purifying the kli from its tumah. For that, we need a mikvah, etc. We're talking about a different kind of tara, a tara of removing iser. The iser that has been absorbed into the walls of the utensil is really representative of evil, if you will. And therefore, the Torah uses the word vitar to purify yourself. Because whenever the Torah talks about tshuva, It always, throughout Tanakh, emphasizes the concept of purification, of Tara. So I'd like to spend a little time with you on Erev Rosh Chodesh Av to analyze what these two methods metaphorically represent, the Mayim and the Eish. And I gave a drasha many, many years ago between Kesel Yosef, meaning during the Aseret Make Tshuva, when I always used to speak about Tshuva. And I compared the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination within man, to a fire. And sometimes to overcome a fire, you need another fire. On other occasions, the fire that burns is more similar to Mayim in the sense that it's not so impossible to deal with, and the challenge of the Yetzer Hara is a little bit lower key. But these two methods of Hagala and Libud in destroying and uprooting Ra, the evil of Isur that's absorbed within the clay Midjan in this case, in this context, is metaphorically representative of two different types of tshuva. Now, I have a book in front of me, which was written by a man, he's not alive anymore, his name was Pinchas Peli. And the man lived in Israel, in Herzliya. He used to fly in from Israel to New York to be with me when I gave my drasha between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. A very capable man indeed, beautiful style of writing Hebrew. He was Israeli. And you should know that I don't always appreciate when people write down my Torah and transcribe it and then try to present it to the audiences. I don't know if you'll find any book that was written based on my oral discourses that I've given an official askama. I don't think you'll find such a thing. But this is the one exception, because Peli did a great job. And I have an edition, this was published by the World Zionist Histadrut HaTzionit Olamit, the World Zionist Congress, and it was published in the year 1974. And it's an anthology of probably about 10 years worth of tshuva drashas that I gave for the days of tshuva and Yom Kippur. And I'd like to reiterate what I said then based on the writings here of Peli. And if you're ever interested, I'll mention that I'm referring to pages 173 to 175. Perhaps we'll get to 177. And I'd like to talk to you about two methods of tshuva. One is a very extreme method of tshuva, and the other is less extreme. And we'll try to compare them and see which of the two we would advocate in favor of. One method is called Biur Bet Yud Ayin Vav Reish HaRav, destruction of evil, to completely eradicate and erase from history, from memory, evil. I could use the word bitul. Bitul means to nullify evil, or akira, to undermine evil. In medical terms, you might call it surgery. Not always is it possible to save your patient by using various kinds of therapeutic methods. Sometimes it's necessary, Rahman al-Islam, to amputate, and surgery is the only possible method. What this means is that a sinner, over the course of years and decades of his life, has polluted himself and contaminated himself with the drudge, with the terrible sins. Now he does tshuva. He realizes that he has no choice. He's got to do surgery. He's got to, in effect, erase years and years of his life. in which he was following the path of evil. He can't deal with the evil inclination unless he completely cuts it out and does a surgical operation. Those are the words that I want to use here to embellish this idea of biur hara. Biur hara means to completely consume evil. But there's another method of tshuva, which is called ha'alas hara. I will spell it for you. Hey, ayin, lamed, aleph, hey, aleph, tav. Ha'alah. And that means literally to raise the evil. Instead of burning the evil and consuming it with a fire and cutting it out like surgical operation, it means to take sin and build on it and uplift it. That sounds quite paradoxical. How can you take sin and uplift it? But as I said then, efshar livnot et hatid, you can build the future al yisodot havar, on the fundamentals of the past. And halas hara means I don't destroy the past, but I build on it. And Chazal say that b'makom shebali tshuva omdim afil tzadikim gmurim minamom, a person who does tshuva and he uses the evil and the sin that he perpetrated to project him to greater and greater heights of good, and now the Ra keeps pushing him. It's like a dynamism. It's like an energy force that projects him forward. He reaches levels of a Baal Tshuva that even a Tzaddik Gomor could not achieve. And in this context, he's not going to cut out the past. He's not going to try to forget the past. On the contrary, Ein lachote lishkoach, the sinner should not forget the past. And I believe that the classic example in Shas of this concept is Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish makes the following statement, and this is quoted in the Gemara in Bav Metzia. I'm sorry, the Gemara in Yuma, and then we'll get to the Gemara Bav Metzia on Daf Vavam and Beis. Amar Reish Lakish, Gedola Tshuva says donos nasislo kishgagos. How great is tshuva, that which he did deliberately now becomes in the eyes of the Lord as if he did it inadvertently. Kishgagos. Shenemar shuva Yisrael ad Hashem Elokecha ki kishalto bavonecha. And it's called an avon, which means a deliberate violation, and yet it's called kishalta. Kishalta is a choge, where you tripped and you fell. Then Reish Lakish makes a different statement, and he says, Gedola Tshuva shes donos nasos lo kizachios. This is the Gemara that we did just 2 days ago. And through Tshuva, imagine, a zadon now becomes a schus. It's a merit. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, Reish Lakish seems to contradict himself. Is it donos nasim lo kishgagos or nasim lo kizachios? And the Gemara answers kan mi'ava and kan mi'ir. There are two categories of tshuva, says the Gemara, to explain Reish Lakish. There's tshuva mi'ira, which means he's afraid of the repercussions of sin and the punishment. And in such a case, that tshuva mi'ira makes his donos into shgagos. And then there's tshuva mi'ava, not out of a sense of fear, but out of projecting me as love, the love that I have for God and fulfilling his will. Because if you love someone, you want to fulfill their will. And that leads to a level of zdonos nasilo ki zachuyos. And I sense that Reish Lakish is actually a personification of his own Torah, his own presentation and his insight of tshuva mi'av. The Gemara tells us in Bav Metzia on Daf Pei Dalid, who was Reish Lakish? Reish Lakish was brought up, according to Rabbeinu Tam, as a very fine, potentially budding scholar, a Talmud Chacham, but something happened. We don't know exactly what happened. And as we'd say in contemporary language, idiomatic phrase, he went off the derech. He stooped so low that he became the chief of all the listim. Listim are literally martyrs or robbers, but sometimes they're even murderers. And Reish Lakish was the top banana until Rabbi Yochanan got a hold of it. And Rabbi Yochanan had such an impact on Reish Lakish and his soul that Reish Lakish went back to be what he was originally and even greater. Rav Soloveichik in the Ala Tshuva says that Tshuva zu shel halas hara he Tshuva mi'ava. Reish Lakish used all those years in which he was the head of the listim. Maybe they were cannibals. I don't know what they were. They were the lowest of the low. And he used that to project himself forward to such a state that Rabbi Yochanan eventually had to admit that Reish Lakish was even greater than he was, because Bali Tshuva supersede and they go beyond the level of a tzad. And all this is called halas hara. The memories of the past can project a person to the future in a very positive way, the energy force. And this is the halacha, that even those zdonos, those were deliberate crimes and violations, in the case of Reish Lakish for who knows how many years, now they become an energy force and zachiyos in the process of tshuva. And perhaps, getting back to our parsha, these two methods of kasher and kaleb, of hagolah and libun that are mentioned in our parsha here, in Mattos, in the aftermath of the battle against Midian, these are paradigmic of these two categories of tshuva. And let me call your attention to Eish, to Libun. And we said before, the fire of the Yetzer Hara burns, and it's impossible to defeat it. We need another fire. Sometimes it means we have to run away. We have to cut ourselves completely off from the past. We cannot live with the memories of the past. They are too powerful. They continue to influence us like a fire that burns desires and lusts within us. We need a fire, a very radical revolutionary fire, a surgical operation to cut ourselves off from the past. That is biur hara. Biur is sreifa. Ein biur chametz el sreifa. To be mavayir the ra and consume it, you need a fire, something very far-reaching and radical, a change in one's life in which he completely cuts himself off. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva goes as far as advocating that a Baal Tshuva should change his name. Klomar, says the Rambam, Eini oso aish. I'm a transformed person. The person who sinned is not the person who stands in front of you today. I have completely cut out all those years. And that was a mechika, and a bittul, and an akira. That is called biur hara. And that's one method, a very radical method, but very necessary under certain conditions, of cleaning out and purifying the sinner by burning the past. Like libun, in the case of klei isa, to reach a state where you purify the kli by burning out its isa. And that is tshuva miyira. But there's tshuva mi'ava, in which zdonos nasamlo kizachios, and all those years that Reish Lakish served as the chief of the listim, the lowest of the low, the robbers and the thieves, those years themselves are not to be forgotten. And I'll prove it to you. In a discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, recorded in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Rabbi Yochanan tries to evoke an expression of gratitude from Reish Lakish for what Rabbi Yochanan was able to do in impacting on Reish Lakish's life and bringing him to the level of tshuva. And Reish Lakish has a very, very strange response. He says to him, Rabbi Yochanan, what did you do for me? They called me Rebbe, and now they called me Rebbe. When I was the head of the listim, they called me Rebbe. I was a trainer for robbers. And now the scholars are calling me Rebbe. Now, you know, my friends, this year is dedicated. Its goal is to present to you the Torah of Rav Soloveichik. But I'm going to stray a little bit from the past and from my general agenda, if you don't mind, just for a few minutes, because I want to share with you an insight of Reb Tzadok HaKohen, the pre-Tzaddik, if you've ever heard of it. It's a great thinker and a brilliant Talmud Chacham as well, because I think it is just simply the next step, extending what we said before based on the Al HaTshuva. Reb Tzadok asks the obvious questions here. How could Reish Lakish say to Rabbi Yochanan that you didn't do anything for me? I was a Rebbe then and I was a Rebbe now. Yeah, you were a Rebbe then for whom? For the lowest of the low. Now you're a Rebbe for genuine Torah scholars. And Rabbi Yochanan didn't do anything for you? How could Reish Lakish say such a thing? And furthermore, the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yochanan was very hurt by this statement. He was a little bit put off and insulted. Why did Rabbi Yochanan take such a statement seriously? It's foolishness. For the great scholar Reish Lakish to say that before I was a Rebbe and now I'm a Rebbe. And at the end of the Sugya of Metzia, Rabbi Yochanan concedes that he, Reish Lakish, is greater than he himself. Why? Because he was the head of the listed. Very strange. Says the Pri Tzaddik, one of the most profound insights. Reish Lakish will be rewarded for all his years as the head of the listed, because tshuva me'ava is donos nasim lo kizochios. Is donos, those very low sins, are zochios, says Reb Tzadok. They are transformed through tshuva into a positive force for which he's rewarded. So as Rabbi Yochanan, who's born a tzaddik and remains a tzaddik, he will be rewarded just for his acts of tzidkus and righteousness. Reish Lakish has one up on him because he was the Rebbe of the listim. And as such, he will be rewarded for all those years, those very actions. And this is a very profound idea. Hashem is with us, even when we sin. And Hashem is calling out to us to ask us to do tshuva. And if the sin itself, inherent in the chet, is the power and the force of halas HaRav, to, shall we say, upgrade the person and inspire him to greater and greater heights on the spiritual ladder, and Zdonos nasim kizochios, those very Zdonos become zochios. That's not something that Rabbi Yochanan could say about himself. Only Reish Lakish could say about himself that all those years of Zdonos are now zochios, that my tshuva me'ava has transformed all those Zdonos into zochios, and therefore greater is the Baal Tshuva than the tzaddik. And Rabbi Tzadok concludes his presentation in the Pri Tzaddik. And if anyone wants, I can send it to you. You could read it yourselves. And he says, why is it? It's very strange that the Tanakh tells us about all the iniquities and all the sins of the people of Israel over and over, parsha after parsha, and it's written and recorded for all eternity. God loves his people, and yet he publicizes their iniquities, their sins, recorded in the, for all of posterity, for all of infinity in the Torah itself. Is that the way he treats his beloved nation? And the answer, says Reb Tzadok, is because all those sins are really opportunities in which, as a result of tshuva, zdonos nasim kizochis, there's almost, again, I'm afraid to use this term, he doesn't use this term, there's almost a sanctity in the sin, which doesn't mean that you can engage in sin, but it means that if you fell and then you did tshuva, and it's a tshuva of halas hara, to use the Rav's terminology, then these sins themselves become zchusim, become great merits for the Jewish people. Now, at the outset, I said that we were going to spend some time also on Parshas Masai, which we'll read on Shabbos. Let me turn to Parshas Masai and call your attention to the Parsha of the Ir Miklat. We're talking about a Rotzech B'Shogeg, somebody inadvertently caused the death of someone else, and the Torah writes that such a person has to run and flee to the Ir Miklat. Now, I want to point out to you on a pasuk here in Perek Lamed Ches. Let me just try to find the pasuk. I know that Chaim in particular likes to see it inside. Here it is, pasuk Yud Zayin. So we're in chapter 38 of Bamidbar. I'm sorry. I think it's 35. Sorry, 35. It's the hay looks like a ches in my print. And it's verse 17. And now the Torah is talking about a rotzeach b'mezid, a deliberate murder. And it says, "Ve'even yad asher yomas bo v'hiko vayamos rotzeachu and mos yumas harotzech." If he struck him with a fist-sized stone, which is deadly, and he dies, he's a murderer. So the Gemara in Baba Kama on Daf Tzadi derives a principle from this pasuk, and that is what we call umdana. I'll explain what umdana means. In a case of umdana, a person cannot be condemned for a capital crime of murder unless we can evaluate the murder weapon and many other factors to make sure and guarantee that we can determine that the actions of the murder were sufficient cause for the death of the victim. That's called umdana. The Rambam says that this halach of umdana applies to a rotzeach b'mezid, but not to a rotzeach b'shogeg. With regard to the death penalty, the Rambam says that we require an evaluation to determine that the action of the murder was sufficient cause of death. However, this is not applicable, says the Rambam, to an accidental killing for which the penalty is golus to exile to the city of refuge. However, I believe that Tosfos in Masechta Ksubos on Daf Lamed Hey has a different opinion, because Tosfos in Ksubos is of the opinion that whenever there are limitations imposed on the death penalty, then there are even more limitations that are imposed on Golos. So if the limitation is that there's no death penalty without an evaluation in Umdana, as we said before, then I believe that according to Tosfos, even in the case of Rotzeh Peshogeg, as far as Golos is concerned, you would have that same restriction. Because Tosfos' Shita is that there are more restrictions in the case of Golos than there are in the case of Rotzeh B'Mezid. For example, this is Tosfos' proof. Gemara establishes in Masechta Makos on Daf Zayin that to be chayav golos, you have to kill in what's called b'derech aliyah. Aliyah means with an upward motion. But if you're coming down, let's say you trip on your way down a ladder, that's called derech yerida, then there's no golos. And Tosfos says we don't have any parallel in Rotzeach B'Mezid, whether he's going up or going down. You see that the restrictions are even greater. The conditions for sending a man into Golus are even more strict than they are with regard to a Rotzeach B'Mezid. And therefore, by definition, according to Tosfos, any restriction or limitation in the Chiyuv Misa, in a capital case of a Rotzeach, certainly would apply to Rotzeach Peshogeg. So if you're telling me you can't send a person to his death unless you did an umdana, then how much more so would that apply to the Chiyuv Golus? But yet the Rambam writes that in the case of Golus, we don't have to have an umdana, and he will have to run to the Miklat as long as we determine that he shot the gun. It seems to me that the dispute between Tosfos and the Rambam is revolving what we call Gzeras HaKosuv versus Svara. Gzeras HaKosuv means that sometimes Jewish law will operate with rules and principles that are not necessarily rational. We don't know exactly why. But these are hard set core rules. And Tosfos understood that one of those rules is that whatever limitations apply to Rotzeach B'Mezid, then ipso facto, they apply to Rotzeach B'Shogeg. Hence, if you need an umdana in the case of Rotzeach B'Mezid, in order to put him to death, you cannot send an inadvertent killer to the Ir Miklat without an umdana. That's called Gzeras HaKos. The Rambam, on the other hand, operates with what we call Svara. And the Rambam thinks the following, that when the halacha makes a difference between derech aliyah and derech yerida with regard to Rotzeach B'Shogeg, that's a logical distinction. Why? Because if you're climbing up, then it's not so common in a derech aliyah that you would drop an object. The Torah says vayapel alav vayamos, and the Torah is telling us that dropping an object while climbing a ladder on your way up is less common than dropping an object when you're walking down the ladder. And therefore, when a person is descending a ladder, then he has a great responsibility to be careful, because it's more common to drop an object when you're climbing down. So therefore, the halacha of derech yerida is not a gzeras hakosov. It's a logical rule. 1 second. And this logical rule tells me that if the murder took place inadvertently, but derech yerida, there's a certain element of negligence here that he should have been careful about, because it's so common to drop things on your way down. But to fall off on your way up, that's a real shogeg. And there, the level of negligence is only so and so, and therefore you go into goals. But derech yerida is already what we call karv l'meis. But based on the Rambam's shita, that we don't automatically assume that any restriction that applies to a rotzeach b'meziv automatically ipso facto applies to rotzeach b'shogeg, but rather we apply our logical reasoning and the laws of who is considered a shogeg and has to go to the miklat are logical. The Rambam says in that context, umdana is completely irrelevant. We don't have to know whether or not he should have understood that he's holding on to a stone and it's so heavy, and if he drops it, it'll kill him, and so forth and so on. That's relevant to an intentional murder. When we accuse him of an intentional murder, we have to know that he was holding on to a weapon that was weighty enough and powerful enough to kill somebody. But in the case of Rotzeh Shogeg, we're not talking about his deliberate calculation of killing someone. He totally accidentally killed him. And therefore, the concept of umdana is totally inapplicable. I'm just going to add one more piece, and then we'll have to call it a night. And again, I always thank you as usual for joining me. Special thanks to those who have opened up their cameras, so I know I'm talking to human beings and not just to a flat thing with a name on it. I don't even know if that name is the real name or not. Anyway, I want to talk to you about a pasuk, and with this we'll conclude, towards the end of Parshas Masai. And you'll take a look, if you will, in Perek Lamed Hey, pasuk Lamed Gimel. So in chapter Lamed Vav, chapter Lamed 36 and verse 33. Excuse me.
There is no verse 33 in chapter 36.
I'm sorry. Did I say 36 or 35? I keep forgetting.
You said both of them.
At the end of 35.
Okay, thank you.
Towards the end of 35, it should be verse 33. I think so. If not, I mean, in the 5 minutes I have.
Below tachanifu?
Below tachanifu.
Yeah.
You shall not corrupt the land in which you live, for blood corrupts the land. And we're talking about the land that's not willing to look aside in a case of murder, where the blood of an innocent victim has been spilled on the ground. I want to quote to you, somebody actually transcribed a lecture that I gave many, many years ago. Mother Earth reacts to sin. She condemns the sinner ruthlessly. She is very sensitive to moral wrong. Sin defiles not only human beings, but the earth itself as well. The earth becomes desecrated and polluted by crime and needs atonement. In the case of murder, the atonement can be made to the land only by the blood of the murderer. Or in the case of illicit sexual relations, by casting out the sinner. And this is a unique concept to speak of tumah, of impurity, as attached to Mother Earth. We're ascribing to the earth a metaphysical quality. Sin and atonement for sin are concepts that apply to man. But here, the Torah is talking about the earth. You shall not corrupt the land and pollute the land. Man is a part of the earth. Man is an extension of nature. Man can never free himself from his union with the earth. Earth, nature, and man flow into each other. When we use the word earth, we're not just talking about the land, we're talking about nature as a whole. The entire complex of physical conditions that make man's existence possible. As an organism, he depends upon his surroundings. And this dependence spells and translates into a certain union and a uniformity with nature itself. Obedience to God means I will give your rains in their time, the land will yield its produce, and the tree of the field will give forth its fruit, but disobedience, I will make the skies like iron and your land like copper. Your strength will be expended in vain. Your land will not yield its produce. Neither will the tree of the earth give forth its fruit. A pasuk at the end of Vayikra in Perek Chavav in the Tochacha. There is a certain metaphysical unity, a confluence of man and nature. And this is a very important postulate in Jewish thought. There's a coexistence and a co-responsibility. It's both negative and positive. Man's sins, as well as his good deeds, are also attributed to nature. Man can corrupt and defile nature, or hopefully sanctify nature. If man is good, then Mother Earth is credited together with man and shares her blessing with man. In the case of man who sins, the earth is defiled and the earth bears the brunt of his crimes. But to free herself from that indictment, she must denounce man. She must dissolve the ties that prevail between earth and man. Mother Earth has no choice. Otherwise, she will be branded as a criminal. And again, this is part of a longer essay, which has been transcribed and published in a book called The Emergence of Ethical Man by Rav Joseph B. Soloveichik. And if you have an inclination towards philosophy, it's a very, very fine piece of work. But I still go back to my original assumption that Rav Soloveichik only gave his haskama to this book that I mentioned earlier. Okay, then Rabbosai, this is where we're going to stop for today. Parshas, Mattos, Masai, a double parsha for Rosh Chodesh Av. We should be zoche to learn Torah together. And although Av is a month of Avelus, but it's also a month that will be converted in Yis Hashem into Sason, the Simcha, and those are our pleas and our petitions to the Almighty that He transform this month of Av, the month in which, according to tradition, Mashiach is born, into days of Sason v'Simcha, Kein Yiratzon. Amen. Mashiach should come speedily in our time.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.